Well, hello, Nigel. Thank you so much for being here.
It's an absolute pleasure to be here, Eleonora. Thank you.
Sure. Let's start with the breaking news. Biden's long-awaited decision to allow Ukrainians to strike targets in Russia with their long-range missiles, ATACMS. Do you think that will actually change something in this war, or is it too little, too late?
It's a decision that's been slow in coming. I think it's a good thing it has been made, but I think Russia tactically has gone some way to preparing for it, to mitigate the direct military consequences. So it's been able to move some of the assets that these missiles would strike beyond the range of the ATACMS, which is essentially around 300 kilometers. Nonetheless, even if the military consequences are limited, although they will be helpful to Ukraine, the broader significance is political and symbolic. When this issue was first publicly discussed in the summer, Putin was really quite clear and specific that if the West, and particularly America, were to take this decision, it would, as he put it, change the essence of the war, and that he would judge NATO to be a direct participant in it. He used those words as a deterrent threat against such a decision. America has now chosen, nonetheless, to go ahead with this. So all eyes now on what Putin might do. He has put himself rhetorically in a position where, in a sense, he has to respond in some way. He cannot ignore this decision. So what next? Will this be part of a further spiral of escalation?
But this is not the first time that a red line has been crossed by the West. I mean, Putin, if I'm not mistaken, considered also tanks as a red line, and yet the West decided to provide Ukraine with tanks eventually.
You're right. And in that perspective, one can see this step that America has taken as the latest in a series of slow escalatory measures. Initially, the decision to support Ukraine after the beginning of the invasion, and then the debate about tanks, then the debate about planes, and there are other examples as well. I think what makes this different in some way is that Putin, in trying to avert this latest move, was used more threatening and more specific language than I've seen him use before. The only comparison that comes to mind is right at the beginning of the war, when he announced his invasion. He said at that time, any country that tries to hinder us in achieving our objectives in Ukraine will face consequences of a kind they have never before in history, a veiled implicit threat of some sort of nuclear escalation. Now that, as we know, didn't happen, but we have here again seen this specific language, Putin saying he would consider now NATO to be at war with Russia. He didn't say what specifically Russia's response would be, but he has set himself up, again, rhetorically, to demand of himself, as it were, and of Russia, a response. It would be, in a sense, a big loss of face, I think, of a kind that Putin would wish to avoid if he doesn't respond. So yes, he growled, as it were, in warning about tanks and about fighters, but his language on this occasion has been more threatening, and I think we're all waiting to see what his next move is.
I see. And speaking of America, Trump's election will obviously have a great impact on the war against Ukraine, but the debate on what kind of impact exactly that will be is heated. On the one hand, we have people who think that Trump's election could be actually a good thing for Kyiv. On the other hand, we have people very worried and concerned about a possible reduction in U.S. support for Ukraine. So, what do you think that impact will look like for Ukraine and also for the U.S.'s relationship with Russia?
Yes, we're all wondering and worrying about this. And I think we have to say at the outset, there is a very wide range of possibilities. Personally, I am towards the more worrying rather than the more hopeful end of the spectrum of predictions. And yes, there have been people in Kyiv and people who support Kyiv who have offered the view that this in some way could be helpful to Ukraine. It's hard for me to see in any detail what the case for that would be. What we do know is that Donald Trump is intrinsically unpredictable and revels in unpredictability. We also know that he has much less of a moral or political commitment or attachment to European security as such, not just Ukraine's security. Little, if any, sense of a commitment based on common values. We know that he's intensely transactional in nature, rather than believing in the solidity or obligation imposed by long-term commitments. All this is a recipe for uncertainty. In addition to that, listen to some of the things that the future Vice President, J.D. Vance, has been saying in quite specific terms about ending the war on terms that would be essentially unfavorable to Ukraine. That's all very worrying. In mitigation of that, perhaps, one can look back at Trump's record the first time round after 2016. And yes, there were certainly worrying aspects of his relationship with Russia. The fact that Putin seems to be the only leader anywhere for which Trump has never had an unkind word. There's his statements about believing Putin rather than his own intelligence services and so on. And yet there were things even then that Trump did that were unwelcome to Putin. He did provide Javelin anti-tank weapons to Ukraine. He also imposed at that time sanctions on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, ironically then lifted by the Biden
And on Rusal.
And Rusal as well. Exactly right. The final point I suppose to make here is that American policy won't in every aspect be decided by the president alone. There are some things that require congressional approval and support. In the first instance, that means some of the appointments that he's making. And there are, people are looking closely at, for example, his candidate for the head of Director of National Intelligence. Will she be approved? But also, I think there is a sense, even now, that there is enough pro-Ukraine sympathy and support in the Republican Party that controls both houses of Congress, that there would be restraints and limits on the extent to which Trump would abandon Ukraine, even if he wished to. But we'll have to see. We're in uncharted territory, and frankly, there's a great deal of uncertainty.
Right. Back to Europe now. In the case that the U.S. support for Ukraine will actually decrease, do you think that Europe, the EU, and the UK has the means to step up its own assistance and to give Kyiv what it needs to prevail in this war? And specifically, what could be the role of the UK?
So firstly, if one defines the means available in terms of raw economic strength, because economics are the foundations of military power, then the answer is unquestionably yes. Europe's total national income, gross domestic product, vastly exceeds Russia's. The key question is not where the balance of power lies, but where the balance of commitment, the balance of resolve, the balance of political will. And you have a situation at present where Russia's, as it were, economic pie is much smaller than Europe's, but Russia has the political will to devote a much larger slice of that pie than Europe. I was discussing these sorts of calculations and comparisons just the other day, and someone pointed out to me, it's a really striking fact, that if you look at the total amount of economic help that Europe has provided to Ukraine so far, it roughly amounts to the cost of 1 cup of coffee per citizen per month, which, if you think about it, is a very small sacrifice indeed. And the European citizens could afford, without difficulty, to provide the equivalent of many more cups of coffee per month. It's nice to discuss coffee in Italy, of course. So it's really a matter of the will and resolve and commitment. Not only in providing a slightly greater proportion of what Europe already has, but more fundamentally in making the proper and urgent investments in greater defense industrial capability, turning more of its stuff into factories and other facilities to produce the weapons that Europe needs for its own defense and that Ukraine needs for its. There are decisions that should have been taken over 2 years ago here, and it's frankly a shameful act of neglect that Europe has not done this, and it really needs to get together and just acquire the political will to do that. On Britain specifically, well, I have to say we are towards the upper end of European countries in respect of the commitments that we have made already. I will just add that on resources, there is one further measure, I believe, that Europe has a decisive contribution to make, and that's accepting the case for seizing the over $300 billion of Russian central bank assets that were frozen at the beginning of the war. So in February 2022, when those tanks went across borders, the G7 countries, including the EU, all agreed very quickly to freeze, to prevent Russia from gaining access to this huge sum of money, $300 billion, and just keep it frozen in their financial systems. The debate ever since has been what to do with that. Now, there's been a kind of unhappy compromise, I would say, where the G7 has said, okay, we'll keep it where it is, that $300 billion, but we'll use the interest payments to guarantee a $50 billion loan to Ukraine. And that's just not enough. $300 billion is the ultimate and underlying prize. That's double Ukraine's current national income. That really would be a game changer. It would be using the aggressor's money to help protect and support the victim. And it's the EU that has been the veto point on this. Not the United States, not Britain, not Canada. It's been a small number of EU countries which have said no to that. So if we are, again, to offer a proper answer to your question about the means, we have our own means, but we also have Russian means available. And in the scheme of things, that should be an easy strategic and moral decision to make.
Absolutely. Thinking of, Russia and the Putin's regime, which, by now doesn't really have a political opposition at home. I saw yesterday the rally that the Russian opposition in exile organized in Berlin. And the rally had some, roughly 1,000 people joining, and was actually a sparkle of hope that the Russian opposition, which we know is currently divided and pretty weak, could maybe be more compact and effective. What's your take on this? Do you think the Russian opposition in exile could eventually become a force for good for Russia? And in case, do you think the EU and other Western allies could do anything to help it become stronger?
Yeah, I would say this has been a difficult few months generally for the Russian opposition. I mean, they suffered the appalling tragedy early in this year of the sudden death and very suspicious death of Alexei Navalny, the most talented opposition leader of his generation. And as you say, in effect now, there is no organized opposition anymore in Russia. It's either been silenced or forced abroad. Now, as for those in exile, again, as you know, there have been a number of embarrassments and even scandals that have divided them, including, just to take one example, the allegations by Navalny's people that Leonid Nevzlin, a long-time business partner of Mikhail Khodorkovsky, formerly the head of Russia's largest private company before he was arrested by Putin in 2003, that this Nevzlin was responsible for an attack on one of the senior Navalny figures in Vilnius. And that's not the only example. In addition to that, there were some things which were said by some of the very brave political prisoners, because that's what they were, who were released in the large prisoner exchange we had earlier this year. People like Vladimir Kara-Murza, unquestionably very brave people who suffered terribly at the hands of Putin's regime. And they were released. They, in effect, were granted their freedom as part of this exchange. And they said some things when they're released that certainly Ukrainians and some others were very unhappy about, in particular suggesting that some of the sanctions on Russia should be lifted. So there is very little trust on the part of Ukrainians towards most Russian opposition figures. So this has been sort of a difficult time. On the other hand, I think it's worth pointing out that the Putin regime itself does not seem to view the Russian opposition in exile as harmless. They are going after them. They, in some cases, are hunting them. You know, I know people abroad, members of the exile community, that are under police protection in the UK. You know, so our government judges that these people, you know, face a threat. And I'd add to that some of the investigative journalistic work that some of the Russian opposition figures do, and some of their exile online news portals, I think, do valuable work in exposing some of the things that are going on in Russia. Whether their work, whether their contribution can go beyond the informational, as it were, and that they can become, in their own right, a political force that in some sense makes a difference or might make a difference to what happens in Russia one day, that's much harder to see at the moment. And I would say this is part of a long history, I would say sadly familiar in Russia, of opposition forces fighting and disagreeing with one another as much as they seem to oppose and resist and disagree with the regime that they all share an opposition to. So I'm not optimistic in the short term, but I would just, again, point to the fact they are doing valuable work in some sort of brave investigative, sort of journalistic endeavors.
On this moderately positive note, we can conclude our chat. It was really a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you again for being here.
Likewise, a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.